Hello, I'm Anabel González, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to TradeWinds and welcome you back. Our virtual event series where we discuss the future of global trade and investment in a changing landscape with leading policymakers and top experts from across the world. Thanks to all of you for being here. I am very happy to inform you that we keep expanding our reach across the world with participants coming now from 106 countries. But you know well by now that our goal is to reach all 164 WTO members. It's an ambitious goal, so please keep coming and also bring your friends with you. So this is our fifth episode of Trade Wins in 2021. And we will discuss today what trade and environment negotiations agenda for the WTO, a topic that is gaining momentum as countries focus on supporting a green recovery to build back better. And I am delighted to be joined today by two experts on trade and environment who, over the course of at least 2 decades and maybe more, have been at the forefront of global discussions in this area. Let me first introduce James Bacchus, Distinguished University Professor of Global Affairs and Director of the Center for Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity of the University of Central Florida. Professor Bacchus was a founding judge and was twice chairman of the WTO appellate body. He's a former member of the U.S. Congress from Florida and a former U.S. trade negotiator. He serves on the U.S. Leadership Council of the United Nations Sustainable Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, chaired the Global Council on Governance for Sustainability of the World Economic Forum, and chaired the Commission on Trade and Investment Policy of the International Chamber of Commerce. Professor Bacchus is a joint scholar for the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C., Global Fellow of the Center for International Governance Innovation in Canada, and Pao Yue Kong University Chair Professor of International Law at Zhejiang University in Hangzhou, China. Professor Bacchus is the author of multiple books, including The Willing World, Shaping and Sharing a Sustainable Global Prosperity, and with co-author Inu Manak, The Development Dimension, Special and Differential Treatment in Trade, just recently published. So I was very fortunate to sit with Jim in the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on Trade and Investment for a couple of years and to benefit from his wisdom. I'm also delighted to welcome back my wonderful colleague, Jeffrey Schott, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute, who was my first guest on TradeWinds almost a year ago. Jeff has been working on trade and investment issues at Peterson since 1983. He has also taught at both Princeton and Georgetown universities. He was a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and an official of the U.S. Treasury Department in International Trade and Energy Policy. He is a member of the State Department's Advisory Committee on International Economic Policy, and very importantly for our discussion today, he previously co-chaired the Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee for the U.S. Trade Representative and actually was a member of the committee for almost 17 years. Jeff is a very prolific writer on many topics in the trade area, including on trade and climate change. And I actually started my career in trade by reading some of his earlier books, and I became a fan ever since. So welcome to both of you, and thank you very much for being here with us at TradeWinds. I will turn to Jim and Jeff in a moment, and just to remind our audience, as usual, to get ready to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the platform, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So as major economies move forward with ambitious goals and plans to green their economies and build back better, the time is ripe to focus on the nexus between trade, sustainable development, and the protection and preservation of the environment, not least to strengthen resilience in the face of global challenges. As recently stated by the new WTO Director General, Dr. Akonjo Iweala, trade policies can help unlock the green investment and innovation needed to decarbonize our economies and create the jobs of the future. In addition, to reach the Paris Agreement goals and achieve climate neutrality by 2050, all tools, including trade policy, should support climate action. The first paragraph of the founding charter of the WTO makes it clear that sustainable development and the protection of the environment are central goals of the WTO. So clearly, the organization can and should contribute more to addressing global environmental sustainability challenges. Early progress could come by finalizing the long overdue WTO negotiations to limit harmful fish subsidies, a key opportunity for members to walk the talk on the environmental front. In addition, for the next WTO Ministerial Conference, scheduled for the end of November this year, WTO members could agree on a set of immediate deliverables, like the liberalization of trade in green products and services that are central to environmental stewardship. But more is needed. A work program for addressing other pressing issues in the trade and environmental front could help structure the WTO's future agenda in this area. In November 2020, a group of some 50 WTO members across different regions and levels of development, co-led by Canada and Costa Rica, launched structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability with a view to collaborate, prioritize, and advance on conversations in this area. In their first meeting earlier this year, members highlighted a set of potential topics for discussion: trade and climate change, decarbonizing supply chains, the circular economy, biodiversity loss, fossil fuel subsidies, and carbon border adjustment measures. So this is a good start for a revamped conversation on the topic at the WTO. So let me now turn to you, Jim. Welcome again, and thank you very much for being here with us. And ask you, in your view, what role for the WTO in supporting a green recovery, and what are the critical issues that WTO members should prioritize on the trade and sustainability debate? Thank you.
Thank you, Anabel, and thank you so much for your friendship and your invitation. It's always good to be with my friends from the Peterson Institute, including Jeff Schott. Jeff and I are both of indeterminate age, but we have been working side by side in different roles on trade issues since we were in our 20s. And I'm looking forward to many years of working together lying ahead. This is not to say we agree on everything, which you'll probably figure out once you hear Jeff's own remarks following mine. My premise is a simple one. We must fulfill the objective that's set out on the first page of the WTO agreement from 1995, and that is to pursue trade and other economic endeavor consistently with the objectives of sustainable development. These objectives are set out as 17 goals in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which comprise the UN Agenda for 2030. The last time I looked, every member of the WTO was also a member of the United Nations. So it makes perfect sense for them wearing their WTO hat to do what they promised to do as members of the United Nations. And many of them are in many important ways. The premise of all this thinking, including in the first page of the WTO treaty, is that the future of the economy cannot be separated from the future of the environment. They are one and the same. Indeed, the economy is contained within the environment. We've certainly seen this during the current pandemic, which emerged in all likelihood from the consequences of humanity's further encroachment on our natural habitat. And we're certainly seeing this in all that we're facing now with the arrival and acceleration of climate change. I have been speaking on these issues for longer than I can remember. As Anabel mentioned, my book, The Willing World, is very much about this premise. I lay out there a number of specific proposals of how we need to reimagine WTO rules, not only to keep them from impeding sustainable development, but to make them affirmative agents for sustainable development. I am a free trader. I'm proud to say that without qualification. And I believe that free trade is consistent with the protecting the environment if it's done within the ambit of the right kinds of rules. In many respects, we have the right rules. In some respects, we do not yet have them. What do we do right now? Here, Anabel's question is very much apt. We have a new Director General. We have a WTO that is struggling to sustain its centrality in world trade. And more must be done right now to reassert that centrality. The best way to do so is through concrete accomplishments that will be concluded in this year and possibly affirmed and announced at the WTO Ministerial Conference, which is now scheduled for late this year in Geneva. First on the list, as Anabel said, should be concluding at last successfully the negotiations to eliminate duties on green goods by concluding the environmental goods agreement that's been under negotiation for a very long time. Following on that, we should, of course, eliminate the barriers to trade and environmental services. This is much needed to speed and spread the flow of new green technologies worldwide. In addition, and already very much on the WTO agenda, is the need to add disciplines to the decimating fisheries subsidies that are doing so much to deplete our increasingly unsustainable fishing stocks worldwide. There is every reason for the WTO to move forward to conclude these negotiations successfully this year. I would add that it's long past time for the members of the WTO to get serious about imposing some specific disciplines on fossil fuel subsidies. These subsidies are doubly pernicious now. They're not only a bad idea in the first place, but they are diametrically opposed to our global goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Beyond that, I think it's important that we begin to see all WTO rules and all potentially new WTO rules through the prism of sustainable development. I have argued, dating back to words my colleagues and I wrote in the Appeal in the Shrimp Turtle case in 1998, that all WTO obligations should be seen through the prism of that objective set out on the first page of the WTO agreement. It is relevant context and highly so. And I think in all that we do going forward in the WTO, we need to keep that in mind, not only in our clarification of existing rules, but also in our negotiation of new rules. In Copenhagen, more than a decade ago, I gave a speech that caused some puzzlement as to its relevance, because I said in that speech that the climate regime and the trade regime were ultimately on a collision course, that if we were not careful, would conclude in some very acrimonious and divisive and unhelpful dispute settlement. I think we're almost there. We have not done all that we need to do in the climate regime to spell out what kinds of trade restrictions are permissible as response measures to addressing climate change. We have not done anything nearly enough in the trading system to address the nexus between trade and climate change. Thankfully, we are now starting to do so. But we're reaching the point where we will, I think, within the next year or so, confront this issue in dispute settlement if we don't begin to act soon to avoid that. I say this because our friends in the European Union are on the verge of proposing, as part of their new trade policy and fulfillment of their Green Deal, Euro-wide, what they describe as a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Like my former colleagues in the Congress, and the European Parliament seems inclined to do many things that must be done to address climate change, but not do what I consider to be the most important thing, which is put a price on carbon by enacting a carbon tax. The best way to enact a measure that would be consistent with WTO obligations would be to enact a carbon tax. There we have some jurisprudential issues, which I think could be solved by the first ever legal interpretation by the members of the WTO. For those who are interested in some of the details, Article 2.2a of the GATT has from the beginning permitted border tax adjustments. Under that provision in the GATT, a border tax adjustment equivalent to an internal tax is permitted as a charge on imported products, and likewise, border tax adjustment is permitted also as a remission on exported products. Only, and this is significant, only indirect taxes on products, such as sales taxes, may be adjusted at the border. Direct taxes on producers, such as income taxes, may not be. Now, here's the jurisprudential problem. We don't have any jurisprudence apart from a working party report in 1971 that's part of the GATT acquis, as we call it, but is not necessarily binding in the WTO. We don't know, therefore, whether a carbon tax is a direct tax on a producer or an indirect tax on a product. We also don't know whether a tax on inputs, such as fossil fuels, that are not physically incorporated into a final product is a tax that can be adjusted at the border. What we need is a legal interpretation by the members of the WTO under Article 9.2 of the WTO agreement, confirming that a carbon tax is a tax on a product, and that a tax on inputs such as fossil fuels that are not physically incorporated into the end product is a tax that can be adjusted at the border. The problem, of course, is, as I said, we're unlikely to see either the European Union or the United States anytime soon, purely for political reasons, proceeding with a carbon tax. My understanding is that the Europeans, sometime in the second quarter of this year, meaning perhaps next month, will be proposing a carbon border adjustment mechanism that will be tied to their current emissions trading system. It will either be a part of it or will be structured parallel to it. And this poses quite a few problems under WTO law that the members need to work out before we ever reach dispute settlement. First of all, it could lead to a challenge to the entire European emissions trading system. which I feel is vulnerable in the first place, as it is now, because of the free allowances that it provides to domestic European producers in some sectors. As I see it, these are subsidies, and if they have adverse trade effects, they are illegal subsidies under WTO law. No one has challenged the Europeans on this thus far, but that may happen in response to the enactment of a new carbon border adjustment mechanism. Second, in the tea leaves I'm seeing about the likely nature of this European measure, there are other problems. It appears as though the Europeans want to decide for themselves whether other countries are pursuing climate ambitions that are satisfactory. Well, is this a function of pledges made under the Paris Agreement, which are simply promises? Is this a function of what's actually happening in those countries? Or is it, I would say, necessarily a function of the particular products that are affected by these import restrictions and requirements? These are unanswered questions. There's also apparently an inclination to measure emissions in the way the Europeans have measured them. Well, the climate COP has struggled for decades now to try to agree on a common gauge for measuring greenhouse gas emissions. They have yet to agree on such a global standard. Everyone has their own standard. On the one hand, we're increasingly able to measure these emissions. On the other hand, we have less than a consensus over which particular metrics are appropriate. Furthermore, it's not clear to me that the Europeans are going to allow other countries any type of due process in the application of these measures, which gives rise to all kinds of problems, including under the shrimp turtle ruling, which has now been in place for more than 2 decades in WTO jurisprudence. And lastly, there is always a problem with these types of non-tax trade restrictions, because they will have to be excused under the general exceptions of the GATT. I set aside for a moment the possibility that they may also fall under the TBT agreement or customs valuation agreement or some other covered agreement. The challenge there is to make certain that, and here again I delve into the details, in the provisional justification for an exception as a defense under Article 20 of the GATT, the measures genuinely are environmental measures and not also economic measures. The EU DG Trade officials, who are very smart about these things, have been very careful to speak only about carbon leakage as it relates to the climate, and the fear that emissions will simply be shipped offshore, which of course is an argument for a multilateral solution. This is a legitimate concern, but it will be hard to keep out of the measure, and indeed it would be hard for the United States or any other country to keep out of the measure an expression of economic concern. And once that economic concern is expressed, it doesn't matter under current WTO rules whether there's also an environmental motive. The measure will fail to receive the benefit of the general exception. These are more details than you perhaps wanted at the outset, Anabel. One last remark. I do feel it's possible to thread the needle of WTO law to craft a trade restriction as part of a climate measure that will survive scrutiny in WTO dispute settlement. The problem is that these measures are not going to be written by Jeff and Anabel and me, and a few of our friends who have read all the footnotes and are familiar with all the jurisprudence. These measures are going to be written by politicians, of which I was formerly one, and it will be impossible for them to resist the temptation to allow economic considerations to enter into the crafting of their measure. It's for this reason that I have proposed that the WTO consider the adoption of a climate waiver, something I set out in an earlier book. I've written 3 long papers on this that are online for the Center for International Governance Innovation in Canada. And I have an updated and long chapter on this topic in my forthcoming new book that will appear late this year. I can respond to questions about that proposal later on. At this point, I think I should turn it over to Jeff.
All right. Thank you very much, Jim, for such a comprehensive and substantive initial remarks on the topic. And we will come back to a number of the points that you were mentioning because they're all very, very relevant in this discussion, of course. Let me now turn it over to Jeff. And again, welcome, Jeff. U.S. Trade Representative Designate Katherine Tai has stated that addressing the climate crisis would be a priority for her by engaging with trading partners on ways to tackle this crisis, bolstering sustainable renewable energy supply chains, and ending unfair trade practices. So Jim has talked to us a little bit about the WTO agenda on this area. What do you think a U.S. policy in the trade and environment front would look like, and how could the WTO contribute to it? Over to you, Jeff.
Well, thank you very much, Anabel. I greatly appreciate being invited back. That's always a compliment that you did well the first time that you invited back. And it's a double pleasure to be joining my old friend, Jim, who is very learned in these areas, as he's just demonstrated. Hopefully, Katherine Tai will be the U.S. Trade Representative before the day is up. And she has gotten unanimous support in the Congress, so that's almost a done deal. But she will have a very difficult task. Overall, I agree very much with what Jim has said about the broad trade and environment agenda. I think one would do well to look at the environment chapter of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is probably the most comprehensive text on environmental obligations in any trade agreement, to see where one can move forward with new disciplines to promote environmental objectives in a manner that is compatible with the trading regime. And it covers many of the areas that Jim mentioned. But notably, it has one major omission, and that is climate change. And that was a problem in the Obama administration, and it was an even bigger problem in the Trump administration. And so it's welcome that Katherine Tai has put that on her agenda. She noted that she wants to foster U.S. innovation and production of climate-related technology, and she wants to promote resilient, renewable energy supply chains. As USTR, she doesn't have primary responsibility in either area, but I'm sure she will be working closely with other cabinet department heads on this. And the major area that she can contribute is in dealing in the WTO and trying to resolve the thorny questions over carbon border adjustment mechanisms that Jim mentioned and highlighted so appropriately, which is coming up to be a big area of conflict with the European Union. But so at USTR, Catherine Tai is going to be facing cross-cutting interest. She wants to push a pro-climate agenda, and then she'll have a free rein in doing that in the WTO, but many difficulties, because to push a WTO agenda, you need to have the major greenhouse gas emitters participating in your efforts, whether it's a plurilateral agreement or the full WTO membership. And while the November initiative that you mentioned, Anabel, is very important, it's a very good start, it doesn't include the major emitters, greenhouse gas emitters, the United States, China, Brazil, India, Indonesia. So that is going to pose some difficulties in the WTO context. Doesn't mean you don't do it. It just means that you have to find a way of working with these countries. And it's, I assume, one of the areas where the United States and China may have a chance of working together on a pro-climate agenda, because it's in the interest of both countries to do so, not because one is making concessions to the other. But the USTR also has a responsibility for promoting U.S. exports. And there's going to be pushback against the climate agenda from those that are involved in exporting energy products or energy-intensive manufactured goods. And we do export a lot of manufactured goods that are energy-intensive, many within North America. But we have also been pushing a lot of new exports of LNG. We've always exported coal. And this is going to run against the climate agenda. And the final point is she is pledged to counter unfair and mostly subsidized trade practices. And given her background, I am sure she's going to do that very aggressively. And certainly that's what Congress expects her to do. But the problem arises in that in some of these areas, the United States is getting into the subsidy game to promote industry and development of new technologies. And so this move towards a subsidized industrial policy will cause more frictions in the trading system, and the types of policies we dislike China doing or the European Union doing, we may start emulating and be subject to similar measures or protection in their markets. So it's going to be a challenge. She's got to thread the needle, and it's going to take an effort, a coordinated effort across the administration to push a pro-climate agenda. And there she has the support of a big climate team in the White House. And that's something different than has occurred in the past, and is a very good sign that the climate agenda will have top-level attention in the Biden administration.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff, for presenting to us what could possibly be the U.S. Views on some of these issues, and many topics that both of you have brought to the table. So let me maybe start with one, which is related to Jim's final sort of remark on the need for a waiver in the WTO to consider these issues of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And I know this is something, of course, that you have been writing for a long time. So I wanted to ask you, this is sort of like the in a way, the easiest, but also the most challenging way of addressing this issue. The reason I say it's the easiest way, in the sense it would be sort of like a more umbrella solution to all those different challenges that you were talking about in terms of finding compatibility between these measures and WTO rules. On the other hand, it's probably the most difficult measure, because it would require the support from WTO members. So the question that I want to pose to both of you is, how likely do you think a waiver, a climate waiver, would be in the WTO. Bearing in mind, as Jeff was mentioning before, that some of the largest greenhouse gas emitters are, for instance, not sitting in this group that has been recently established. So, Jim, let me go over to you first, and Jeff, I'll come back to you in a moment.
In the near term, it's not likely at all. This was also true of the NAFTA when we first started working on the U.S.-Canada free trade agreement. When I was a kid in the Carter administration working at USTR, at the same time we started talking about adding services and intellectual property to the GATT. It took 15 years to get those things. And we still have a long way to go in all of them. But the difference here is that we don't have the time for prolonged negotiation and for incrementalism when it comes to climate change. Increasingly, it's obvious to everyone that climate change is here, it's happening, and we're suffering the consequences of it. It's mid-March right now in Orlando, Florida, where I sit, and the temperature today will be 92. This did not happen in my childhood here in this same city. And it's happening all over the world. It's easy for anyone to point out how hard it will be to adopt a climate waiver. That's absolutely correct, but one has to compare that to the options. The immediate option is to dump these issues into dispute settlement and hope for a result that will please everyone on both trade and climate change. It's not often possible for the appellate body of the WTO to do that. And of course, right now, we don't even have an appellate body topic for another day. But I believe we will again. And does the climate regime really understand that if a trade restriction as part of a climate measure is adopted by a WTO member, then it falls within the scope of the WTO treaty? I don't think they fully understand that it will be the WTO that will be making these climate decisions. It won't be the climate COP. This is one of the fraught and tense areas of concern that can be avoided if we get serious about addressing this issue in this different way I proposed. No one has proposed it. I don't expect them to do it next week. But people are now talking about this approach in a way that they did not when I started talking about it some years ago. I think there are challenges in it. I proposed a waiver that it would essentially have three elements. It would be a waiver from the application of WTO rules for trade restrictive national measures that, one, discriminate based on the amount of carbon or other greenhouse gases consumed or emitted in making a product. Two, fit the definition of a climate response measure as defined by the climate COP. And three, echoing Article 20 of the GATT, do not discriminate in a manner that constitutes a means of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or disguised restriction on international trade. Now, this seems simple, but there are problems with it. First is, as I explained earlier, we don't have any agreed way for measuring carbon emissions. Second, the Conference of Parties for the climate regime has talked about climate response measures, but not in this context. and they are nowhere near even considering defining what a legitimate climate response measure would be. What they don't realize is if they don't get about defining it, then WTO jurists will define it for them, de facto in WTO disputes of them. These proposals of mine are, of course, merely starting points. I have an open mind about every aspect of them. But again, my proposal for a waiver is based on my belief from my own experience in politics that it will prove to be impossible for the European Union, the United States, or any other democratically elected body of a member of the WTO to enact a measure that won't run afoul of the WTO rules unless it is a carbon tax and unless the WTO clarifies the legal questions I raised earlier about carbon taxes under Article 2 of the GATT.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. Very clear. Jeff, let me hear your views. Also, I want to intersect a question that we have from Kimberly Botwright from the World Economic Forum, which says, is a temporary waiver possible? For instance, like the one on e-duties, the e-duties moratorium. But
waivers are by definition temporary, Kimberly.
Yeah.
Nice to be with you virtually.
That's good. Thank you, James. So, Jeff, let me hear your views as well.
Well, I look at it this way. You impose a carbon, or you want to impose a carbon border adjustment so that other countries do what you're doing, so that you level the playing field based on your practices. And that is not the best way to engender or promote cooperation, as we are now beginning to see in the discussions between the United States and the European Union. It's just going to lead to new friction. So I will put aside the issue of a waiver, because I don't think that's a short-term issue, as Jim admitted. But I think the politics of this argue that you need to have a moratorium to ban, at least temporarily, carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Otherwise, those types of initiatives are bound to be captured by protectionist interests. And you just listen to the debate in the Congress arguing for, yes, let's put the taxes at the border against dirty imports coming in. Without any consideration of the complexities that Jim was talking about of how you measure it. Do you measure it whether they have a carbon tax? I mean, Canada has a carbon tax. Are they going to impose restrictions on the United States because we don't have carbon taxes? Energy efficiency standards, not just in manufacturing, but in buildings and the inefficient use of energy, whether there are clean energy subsidies. There are lots of different standards, and there's no agreement on what's the appropriate standard. So I think instead of saying let's figure out a way to have a WTO compatible border adjustment, I think we basically say no border adjustments right now, and put pressure on countries to begin to develop sector by sector or whatever means of developing common standards, or at least baselines for climate friendly policies. And one final note. Jim mentioned the subsidy issues on indirect taxes and the like. Well, that goes back to when Gary Huffbauer and I were writing the subsidy rules during the Tokyo round, and it was a problem then, and it's still a problem. And I think Jim explained it very well.
Yeah. So I think that one thing is clear to me from this discussion is that the moment to come back to a discussion of how to address greenhouse gas emissions in a way that is compatible with the WTO has the time is right for discussion in greater level of detail, be it in the way that Jim proposes through the climate waiver, be it in the way that Jeff is alluding to in terms of trying to find more, sitting down and negotiate common standards on some of these issues. But what I think it's not going to be possible is to just sit and let things happen without having a serious discussion around these issues, right? All right. So let me just move now because we have also other questions and of course many other topics that are relevant in this agenda. And I want to use a question by Robert Hamway, who basically asks, what needs to happen for WTO members to begin negotiating new rules, making national government subsidies supporting their firms' activities related to climate change mitigation and adaptation non-actionable? That is, how can WTO subsidy rules be amended to facilitate trade in green technologies and support the transition towards a greener economy? Jeff, you want to come first on this one?
Well, thank you for the question. It is a relevant one because in the early years of the WTO, there was a green box exemption for environmental subsidies. But it was too broadly defined, and indeed, one only has to look at the case of solar panels and the subsidy and dumping cases that evolved to know that one person's pro-climate policies is another person's unfair trading practice. So if thinking about this, I think you need to focus more on promoting the infrastructure needed to make renewable energy resources more attractive to investors, and investing in the production and distribution infrastructure for clean energy, I think, is one way of doing it without subsidizing directly the production of specific products involved in the trade. Promoting sustainable vehicles. There's going to be a problem with the development of electric batteries, the types of batteries needed for transportation. But that would be a key area as well. So I think that's important, but I would say that it's even more important to look at trying to develop cooperative regulatory policies that set higher standards for energy efficiency and support the deployment of carbon abatement technologies within each country. And that's more akin to what's been done in TBT and the like. But I think you're going to get a bigger bang for the buck in terms of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions if you focus on that.
Thank you, Jeff. Jim, your views on this?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything Jeff said, and indeed I agree with all he said today. 2 points here. At first, there's a historical irony relating to the lapse of Part 4 of the SCM agreement, the green box that Jeff just described. It was agreed in 1994 for a period of 5 years that lapsed in 1999. The plan was to revise, improve, and extend it at the WTO Ministerial Conference in Seattle. Because of the environmental and other protests in Seattle, it became impossible for the members of the WTO to renegotiate, expand, and extend this environmental provision in the WTO agreement. I don't know how many people realize that. I oppose one specific change that may be worth mentioning here with respect to determining whether actionable subsidies are illegal under the SCM agreement. As I mentioned earlier, actionable subsidies, those that are not prohibited, they're not conditioned on export performance or on domestic content, but nevertheless are subsidies, are illegal if they have adverse effects. But the adverse effects that are described in the SCM agreement that would render these subsidies illegal are only economic effects. In an ideal world, I would amend that provision to add adverse environmental effects, where subsidies have harmful environmental consequences. That's only one of many ways we need to reimagine these existing WTO rules. And I'm not the only one who has proposed this. My friend Jennifer Hillman and others also support this idea. But I think that would greatly improve the subsidies agreement.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Jim. So we have a number of other questions. Very little time left. I want to thank Vandana Gyanchandani because she's bringing to us the whole dimension of environmental chapters in FTAs, which unfortunately I think we will not have time to address in this episode, but thank you very much for your contributions. And I want to take one question from an anonymous attendee, which is the issue of eliminating barriers to trade in environmental services, which I think is a very important dimension of a positive WTO trade and environmental agenda. So this person asks, how do you propose to do this? And when you talk about environmental services, are you referring to the core environmental services in the US UN classification system, CPC, which refer to waste management or sanitation services and others? Or could this include ancillary services with an environmental end use? So let me turn it over to you, Jim. And since we are close to our end time, unfortunately, I want to ask you for this to be your last comment. So Jim, please.
Thank you. There is, of course, an important logical distinction between eliminating barriers to trading goods and trading services. If you're going to eliminate a tariff, then it's pretty easy to eliminate it against everyone in terms of implementation. But how can you eliminate a barrier to trade and services with one country but not another? These barriers, for example, also often take the form of licensing arrangements. Just how do you make those distinctions? It may be possible politically to make the distinction, but how can it be done administratively? Therefore, as a practical matter, if we're going to eliminate barriers to services, then we pretty much have to do it uniformly and in a way that harmonizes them, or at least has mutual recognition. In answer to the related question, I would define this broadly because the concerns of the WTO should be not just about making WTO rules fit for purpose for the environment as narrowly viewed, but rather for all of sustainable development. So I would define this term broadly in the negotiations, and then as a negotiator, I would try to reach some compromise that would get as much as we could in order to get an agreement underway that we could build on in the future.
Thank you very much, Jim. Jeff,
Thank you, Anabel, and Jeff.
Thank you. Jeff, your views on how to go about trading environmental services in the WTO?
Well, I don't have any profound ideas that will lead to breakthroughs. I think Jim covered the issues pretty well. But I will take a step aside and note that this is something that you have to work with, not just in the WTO context, but in a broader multilateral context. and take advantage of resources in other institutions. And the whole climate and environment area, I think it's necessary to look beyond what the WTO can do it by itself. I think it's critical that the WTO just work in partnership with the OECD on the cooperative regulatory policies that I talked about before, with the World Bank when you were talking about fossil fuel subsidies, because it's critical there to ensure that poor countries have the requisite technical and financial assistance to offset the burden that will be placed on low-income consumers. Sometimes those fossil fuel subsidies are really effectively income support for those people. And so the WTO, working with the World Bank, could find an effective way of phasing out those or phasing down those subsidies in the poorer countries, eliminating them in the richer countries that would have some value. And that's, I think, critical that the WTO start working more effectively with other international organizations. I think it started over the past few years, but it really needs to accelerate now in this area of trade and environment. The OECD has done tremendous amount of work in this area. The World Bank has done a tremendous amount of work, as you know, Anabel. And I think bringing this together will broaden the area of support and add new incentives for countries to begin to work cooperatively together.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff, for those comments on the international governance of these two topics as well, and the importance of working together. So I have to apologize to our audience because it's my fault to bring such a big topic in such a little time. So I promise that we will have a Trade Winds episode 2 on trade and environment, and hopefully Jim and Jeff will agree to be back with us to discuss the blue economy, circular economy, this increased governance that Jeff was referring to at the international level, and so many other issues that we were not able to address today.
Happy to do that, Anabel.
That's excellent. Jeff, I need your yes as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As long as Jim is there, I'll be there.
All right. So I will come back to haunt you very, very soon. So thank you very much, James Bacchus and Jeffrey Schott, for an excellent discussion on the trade and environmental agenda at the WTO. Thanks to all of our PI colleagues who support Trade Winds. Thank you very much to our audience. You had some great questions today, and I promise we will be back to continue our conversations in this area. And please join us in our next episode of Trade Winds on Wednesday, April 7. So until then, thank you all and goodbye.